Guest tonight is Guney Yildiz, political analyst and expert on the affairs of Turkey. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Hello, thank you for having me.
So let us begin with predictions. We still have an embargo at the time of this interview regarding any sort of results from the elections. The polling stations have closed, but we still don't know what's going to happen. Do you think this week, this day, is going to be a breakthrough for Turkey?
Actually, the embargo has just been lifted by Turkey's agency, the election agency. So we know the first results, like the first 1% of the polls were announced, and there are discrepancies between the government, pro-government agencies and opposition agencies in terms of showing different leads in favor of Erdogan or his rival Kılıçdaroğlu. But I believe, like everything I've analyzed in the last few months leading to this moment, I believe we're in the edge of a very important moment. The opposition alliance proved to be very resilient, despite being an unlikely alliance of the secularists, nationalists, Islamists, liberals, and the Kurds. And President Erdogan counted on stoking tensions and poking the political fault lines in Turkey to break this alliance, but the alliance stood together, and the alliance, the main opposition candidate, followed a very positive campaign, suggesting they're going to change Turkey for the better, whereas the incumbent President Erdogan has been running a very negative campaign, saying if you vote for the opposition, things will get very ugly.
Oh, very much so. He has also been using some rather forceful language there. I mean, he's been comparing his rivals in a way that probably does not merit any quotes. Suffices to say that he has called his main rival a drunkard, which is probably tells us everything we need to know about the level of aggression in this campaign. And this was not the only example. Still, you said that we actually have discrepancies in terms of results, and apparently it seems like these results are being released earlier than was originally anticipated. How big are these discrepancies? Do they actually tell us anything, or is it too early to say?
It's actually too early to say, because first votes are being counted are from Turkey's eastern regions, and we all already expect that these predominantly Kurdish regions will produce a breakthrough, like a record for the opposition candidate Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu. So it's known that they're going to vote in high margins, like towards Kılıçdaroğlu. We know that, but it depends on which polling stations first announced their results. So with 1% of the votes, it's still too early. But what is significant is the discrepancies. So it shows that tonight will be a very long night, with opposition and pro-government agencies vying for attention and trying to kind of dominate the narrative. But at the beginning, you mentioned deep state, Jonas, and I want to mention that the word deep state is being used very often in the American politics, but it has actually been coined for the first time in the Turkish context back in 1940s, 50s. So the very word itself comes from Turkey, which is to suggest that there are some elements within the state that cannot be changed through any elections. So they always remain the same, and this has been very much the case throughout the modern Turkish history. But President Erdogan has changed the Turkish state so much that people come to associate the whole state with President Erdogan. My analysis and my on-the-ground research suggests that it's still not the case. Like, President Erdogan doesn't fully control the elements of the state that are hard to shake with elections, for a variety of reasons, including ideological coherency. President Erdogan, although he is known to be known as an Islamist, for example, president in Turkey, but he has followed a very incoherent foreign policy with regard to Islamism, and domestically as well, in terms of his allies, as well as his policies, has been very inconsistent. And there has been various different competing factions from within the state, and I doubt like the main echelons, the upper echelons of the state are in favor of bypassing democracy to support Erdogan. So I believe Turkish democracy will be resilient.
So now you've mentioned inconsistencies, and there were also major changes in terms of the course that Erdogan's party has taken throughout the years. Let's listen to a few quotes concerning this very issue, because they do actually outline certain questions which need to be analyzed further. Let's take a look.
In the last 7 or 8 years, the government has started to do the opposite of what they have been saying for the last 20 years. Erdogan came to power by saying that he will solve the problems of democracy, human rights, freedoms, and the Kurdish problem. And he kept this rhetoric until 2015. In the last 8 years, the policies took a turn and he pushed freedoms, democracy, human rights and the Kurdish problem away with the back of his hand.
The alliance that the AKP formed with the nationalist MHP in 2015 and the new state structure which was quickly formulated as Turkish Islamic nationalism was inconsistent with the AKP's previous promises, and this disappointed certain voters. The AKP policies moved away from being a political party that works on democratization, pushed those voters who expected a change in the 80-year status quo and a solution to the Kurdish problem while protecting the central authority. The first disengagement of voters started after this.
So Recep Tayyip Erdogan is facing a formidable challenge from Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu right now. However, it still seems like his party is quite strong, despite the passage of time. 2 decades, after all, is a long time in politics. What are his greatest strengths? Who are the voters which Erdogan can rely on during this difficult moment for his career?
Yeah, it is probably seen as a magic, how Erdogan managed to, be so popular despite being in power for 2 decades and making so many mistakes in different areas, from foreign policy to the economy and the regressing democratic rights in Turkey. So one of the magic he has is Turkey's political fault lines. So they are so deep that and these political fault lines affect the opposition more than the government itself. Today, the government is a conservative nationalist alliance, and they are very hard on issues like the Kurdish issue, securitizing, as some of the other guests mentioned just a moment ago, securitizing this issue very strongly, but the opposition receives support from the Kurds. And they also very strongly religiously conservative. They have this rhetoric, whereas in the opposition you have Islamist parties, conservative parties, as well as secularists together. So if you polarize the nation through the Kurdish issue, the security issues, and the religious sensitivities, then the opposition will lose. So despite the state of the economy, when the government controls the narrative, and make people polarize on these political fault lines, then it actually helps the government. How government dominates the narrative is because they control most of the media. Almost 80% of the media is being controlled by either directly by President Erdogan through official channels or by people who are very close to him. So they dominate the media. Secondly, they also have huge membership and people, despite the worrying state of economy, some people still do good in Turkey because of their connection to the state, to the government, and these people believe that even if there is an opposition government would lead to a better economic state in Turkey, it might still be disadvantages for them because they would lose their advantages, opportunities by being close to the Turkish government. This is almost like a patrimonial clientelist state affairs when it comes to distributing tenders to cronies.
So Erdogan has been able to achieve what he did through state capture, at least partially, but also through populism. But now that you've mentioned political fault lines, tragically, there are also very real fault lines at play recently with the earthquake. And this tragedy has also struck at what many say has been one of the foundations, in political terms, of Erdogan's power. Many people in the regions affected by the earthquake used to be supporters of the AKP. Do you think that his response to the earthquake, which was severely criticized by many, could actually be Erdogan's undoing?
This is also, I mean, I think the government's response to the earthquake was really bad for a variety of reasons in terms of coordination, planning. I mean, these earthquakes were huge, massive, affecting almost 11 cities. So it was massive, but still the government's response was very weak. And this was all their own doing by not appointing, the people who would be best in their jobs, or by bringing in the military in time to coordinate rescue efforts. So it is, it was a mistake, various mistakes on their side. But since they control most of the Turkish media, then if you watch, 80% of the media, you would end up thinking that, the government's response was adequate, and they did everything that was possible to do in the circumstances. So
it's going to be swept under the rug, right?
But still,
it's going to be partially swept under the rug.
Still,
unless you lived in these regions, you're not going to realize the extent of, the way the government's response was lackluster. But still, this might be a problem for Mr. Erdogan. Now, given that him and the opposition might be going neck and neck, of course, the results are coming in, and we'll be bringing you updates on that. What if there is a very close result? What if Erdogan loses by a very narrow margin? Do you think he might be tempted to say, no, these elections are rigged. These elections have been hijacked by some foreign power, possibly the United States. I'm not accepting these results. What would happen then? Do you think Turkey would be going through the same problems that, for example, America did on the 6th of January? Or Brazil with the Bolsonaristas setting buildings on fire?
I think it will be, there will be some parallels, but some serious differences to Brazil and the US scenario. So if the election results are too close to call or too close to each other, then we can definitely expect President Erdogan and his party to appeal to the results, try to cancel some of the voting in some areas. I mean, how do we know that? Is that they have actually did this in 2019 to reverse the election in Istanbul, Turkey's main city, and there was 13,000 votes, difference between the opposition and Erdogan's candidate, and they repeated the election, but it resulted in people voting even in higher numbers for the opposition candidate. But if they try to do it again now, I think, first time people might have fallen to that, but the second time it might work against them. Why it is different from the American or Brazil scenario is that Turkish state, the actual hierarchical state is very powerful, and it doesn't tolerate, people bypassing the democratic mechanisms unless there is a state consensus. And I don't think there is a deep state consensus on bypassing the elections. So I doubt President Erdogan or his supporters will try that. But we can expect some provocations or maybe some violence that could take place. I hope won't. If the elections results are too close to call to not strongly in favor of the opposition, if in case of an opposition win. But I do expect
it's going to be something to watch for during the next couple of hours and couple of days. How democracy is going to cope with any potential challenges from Mr. Erdogan and his supporters. Guney Yildiz was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And